Today we're hosting Professor Mark Brandt, who is in Michigan State University. Before that, he was in Tilburg, and before that, he did his PhD in DePaul University. He'll be presenting today on depolarization initiatives and how they may have, well, side effects that we don't really welcome. Just to say a few words about Mark and how people in the lowlands think about him, I'll use just two quotes. I did my PhD in Ghent, and there one colleague mentioned, oh, that Mark Brandt guy, he publishes papers more frequently than I change underwear. It was not the most hygienic colleague, I admit, but it tells you something. And the other one is an ex-colleague, maybe you'll admire that one more, from Tilburg, who told me that Mark is a genuine genius. He said it's a once-in-a-lifetime research, and if you look at his Google Scholar profile, you cannot but disagree with me. He was also the first one on the list when Bram and I were thinking about the work package and how to invite, or who to invite as a senior fellow. Unfortunately, the Dutch were faster than us, and so this semester Mark is at the NIAS, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, but we were able to steal him for 2 days, and we're very happy that he's here. So a warm welcome from our side, Mark, and we're looking forward to hearing the results. I think we're the first ones to hear them. Here you go.
Thank you for that introduction. You're supposed to set the bar lower, but it's fine. Yeah, thank you so much for coming and being here. I know this is an unusual day and time for your seminars, but I'm glad that the sandwiches attracted people. People who are watching on YouTube, you don't get sandwiches, so something to think about next time you make that choice. So my work is typically, and what I try to understand is how political attitudes work. That's a big question, which is in part on purpose, because I'm just notoriously unfocused in exactly what I study, because I find lots of things interesting. But one of the things that me and my colleagues have looked at over the years is this general phenomenon where people really dislike social groups, broad variety of social groups, who they see as not sharing their values and their political belief systems. And that's true for both explicitly political groups like voters for particular parties, but also just social groups that are stereotyped to go along with particular values. And so we have seen this as part of this challenge of polarization in our time. Which has now led us to look at how depolarization works more broadly. And so this work that I'm going to show you today is one of our sets of studies, or just one study actually, on this particular topic. I'm a social psychologist by training, and social psychologists, when we learn how to give talks, we present like 84 studies in 10 minutes. And instead, I'm going to take my time and present you precisely one study. And so it's a little bit unusual for my background in that way. But as Jesper said, this is the first time that I'm presenting these results and this idea to somebody outside of my collaborator, Abby Casario, who's a PhD student finishing up her project at Michigan State. And just to be clear how fresh these data are, is that we finished a data collection on now 2 Fridays ago, so a week and a half. You all might have heard that there is this issue with democratic backsliding across a variety of countries. This is the US graph. The US is often exceptional in many ways, and in this case, this is no exception, where there's been this steep decline in democracy, at least according to the VDEM Institute. Now, for people who are really in the weeds of the VDEM people, there's always some present bias. These are not perfect estimates, but especially when you're comparing year to year, you can see there's just been this massive drop off the last year, but really starting in 2016. This has continued and has continued just since I made this slide deck, but just last week, a Republican governor in the US suspended ongoing primaries so that they could redraw a House map that would more favor their political team in the upcoming election. And they did this in part because of a Supreme Court decision in the US that made it easier to draw districts that were biased against black voters. The US is maybe uniquely steep in its decline, but this is a map over the last year, and in 62 countries these countries are moving in terms of being more democratic or being more autocratic, but most of them, as you can see, have become more autocratic. That's the red. And actually, if you go and count through these countries, 4 of the 5 largest countries by population were autocratizing in 2025. So there's a lot of movement that's affecting a lot of people with this democratic backsliding. The 5th country of this 5 largest is China, so it's not that they are particularly democratic. This is just one component of this, is this decline in democracy that people experience. There's general other kinds of polarization that citizens have themselves. So there's effective polarization where people dislike rival parties. In the US, this has been rising quite steeply over the last few decades. And it really is a uniquely strong trend in the US. But it's happening, and there's polarization to be found everywhere. These are 3 other countries from this paper by Garcia et al. And what you can see is actually where everybody ends up in 2020 is about the same level of polarization. Both Canada, Denmark, and Finland. And these countries have different kinds of political systems, all democratic, but and parliaments, but different political systems, different issues that are important to them, and everybody's a bit polarized. And in fact, Denmark might be more polarized than the U.S., which I guess doesn't fit my personal expectations, or guess that would be. But there's polarization there as well. And then finally, the third kind of a leg of this stool of polarization is the support for violence. I actually don't think that these numbers have risen a lot over the years. This is some data from Gallup. You can see it's about 16% of Americans support violence. But violence is also, or potential for violence and political violence is a problem many places. A good colleague of mine, Nazita Lejavardi, and one of her colleagues wrote a paper using data from Sweden looking at local politicians, and they experience a fair amount of violence, and and especially folks, politicians with immigrant backgrounds. And they have other parts in this paper, but with less good figures, so they don't get the figure for this. But that where they find that when the people experience this violence, it pushes them out of politics, and so the violence is making the politicians less representative in that way. So these are 3 quote-unquote polarization constructs. I want to be clear, I'm not saying these are all identical. Sometimes they're not even that strongly related in empirical data, but there are 3 things that both within the academic literature and within the broader societal discussions are things that have been talked about as being problems for our democratic system. So it's partisan animosity, which is this dislike of rival political parties and their voters. Sometimes people call it effective polarization and things like that. Anti-democratic attitudes, so for the violation of democratic norms and values, especially when they favor the party you like. And then partisan violence, which is support for violence against people and politicians from rival political parties. These 3 things, they can exist among political elites, and they do. I mean, the political elites are the people who are instituting these policies and institutions that have contributed to democratic backsliding. Politicians do threaten each other and cause harm to each other as well. But I'm a psychologist, and I typically focus on your typical voter, your typical person, and that's what I'm focusing on today. I'll leave the elites, the laws, and those institutions to my other social science colleagues. So the implied argument with why those 3 constructs are particularly bad is that polarization makes democracy in a pluralistic society hard. It makes it harder to solve societal problems because people don't want to compromise. It makes it harder to hold politicians to account because people don't want to see their favorite politicians in an unfavorable light. It makes it easier to set aside democracy to help our political allies. And I thought I had a 4th one, but I don't. But these are the kind of idea. So this democracy is this polarization is the problem for democracy, and if we could get rid of this polarization, then democracy would be fine. And kind of the idea is that if you have these 2 separate groups that are polarized, they're seen as far from each other, what we need to do to solve polarization and improve democracy is just move people towards the center, and there we'll find the virtue of social cohesion and civility. So this has led researchers and practitioners, NGOs, community groups, and so on to focus on how can we increase civility with the idea that this is going to help us reduce polarization. So one particularly large effort, and this is a really impressive effort by Jan Vokel and his colleagues, sometimes called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge. What they did is they reached out to scholars and community groups and asked them to propose interventions that could reduce polarization, including this partisan dislike, partisan animosity, anti-democratic attitudes, and partisan violence. They then took 25 of these and they took a huge sample of US Americans and they ran studies to see how well they worked, and they identified some of these treatments that worked really pretty well and some that didn't work at all. But we know a lot more about what seems to be depolarizing there. But the whole idea with many of these interventions, we increase civility, we can reduce polarization, and that's good for democracy. Practitioner groups also have worked on this. These groups exist in a number of different countries. I've talked with them from both the Netherlands, but also from the US. Many of the ones on this slide are from the US as part of this coalition of practitioner groups. But they have a number of different strategies and specific things and communities that they focus on, but they are largely aimed at developing programs that reduce incivility and basically turn down the heat of discussion. So they're also aimed at increasing the civility and increasing the social cohesion. One of the measures that they collectively use to evaluate their programs is actually called the Social Cohesion Impact Measure, and it's really designed to measure if they're impacting social cohesion. And so what I want to ask today, and what we ask with our study, is whether or not this is really precisely the right goal that we should have in terms of increasing civility and social cohesion. This, of course, sounds bad in some ways, because I do like it when people are nice, so please be nice to me. But it's also, there's other goals out there. So just two kind of intuition pumps, I would say. So one thing to think about, and this requires some US history, so maybe this is not the best example for an audience in Belgium, but you can think about, when was the US the least polarized? And the answer to that is when Democrats and Republicans agreed about the subjugation of black people. That might be civil, but not if you're a black person who's being oppressed, right? Actually, a lot of the polarization now is around these issues of racial rights for racial minorities and other minoritized groups, whether bisexual minorities and so on. And so, yeah, do we need civility is that really the kind of civility we want? Another way to kind of pump your intuition on this is, who in the US is currently the least polarized? Well, people who do not care about politics. I mean, it sounds actually like a really psychologically much happier life than the one that I live. But if they are not, if you don't care about politics, you're not engaged in politics, you're not part of the democratic process, that also in a democratic system, we want people to be engaged and part of this process. So it's not clear that civility necessarily gets us to outcomes that we want. Basically, the idea here is that these goals of depolarization and civility can clash with other goals, whether that's representing marginalized voices, changing an unjust status quo, challenging misinformation, or just getting involved with politics. All of these require and just end up having some degree of conflict inherent in them. And if people are really focused primarily on civility and getting along and just coming together, we might come together and avoid causing conflict on these other issues that are also important. And essentially, civility is just not necessarily democratic, and it might not also be just. So there's one empirical paper that's looked at two depolarization initiatives and looked to see if there are side effects on other kinds of issues and ways of approaching politics. And in this paper by Blair and colleagues, they worked with one of these big practitioner groups, and they called Braver Angels. And Braver Angels has a few different programs, and one is the Skills for Bridging the Divide, and one is called the Polarizing Within. And they assigned people to one of these two programs or to a control condition. They then completed measures of effective polarization or partisan animosity, and they find that it's a little messy, to be honest. I encourage you to read the paper for that. But it seems like they mostly kind of depolarize, although that's a little messy. But they also had these vignettes that I will also use in our study, where they tell people about a situation where somebody from the out party has some sort of harmful speech. And it's either racist, or it's some sort of vaccine misinformation, or it's misinformation about a recent election. And then they see, do people confront? And what they find is that on average in the full sample, there is no effect on this willingness to confront. But in a subsample of participants that are a little bit more naive to the depolarization kind of idea, they find at least a hint of an effect where it seems to make people less willing to confront this harmful outpartisan speech. There's a lot kind of going on in this paper, and they cut the data in different ways, which, depending on your perspective, might make you more or less confident in these results. But there is some hint, at least, that there might be side effects that we don't want. So our question with the experiment that I'm going to show you today is whether treatments that are known to be depolarizing might have unwanted or unintended side effects. We're going to look at 3. We're going to look at reduced political engagement, reduced willingness to confront harmful speech and prejudice, and increased dislike or prejudice of politically aligned social groups. What I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is going to be structured like this, where I'm going to tell you about the design of our study, and then I'm going to tell you about the DVs and our kind of hypotheses and the logic for each of these outcome measures as they come up. So I'm not going to say anything more about these right here, but we'll get to them as we work our way through the study. So in our design, first, participants, they do their consent. We have attention checks to rule out participants who aren't paying attention, and they do demographics and some other pre-treatment measures. We then randomly assign them to one of 3 conditions. One is a contact project, one is democracy misperceptions, and both of these aim to depolarize people, and I'll talk about them in the next few slides. And then there's a neutral control condition. After that, they complete outcomes that are essentially replications of past work that have used these interventions, and basically they test, do these depolarize like we think they ought to based on past work. So these are replications of past work. And then they complete our measures of potential side effects. And actually we randomize the order of what kind of measures they get when. We collected data from 2 different samples. One sample was from this survey firm called Forthright. They let you collect quota-based representative samples, or hopefully representative samples of the US based on a variety of characteristics. Participants there tend to be relatively inexperienced with experiments, and that's important because we found that in some other samples this causes issues, which I can talk about more because it gets very in the weeds very quickly. And then we also wanted to expand our sample and just try to get a few more people in our study, and so we had collected data from a university sample. All of this was pre-registered beforehand. As you might expect, the university sample is substantially younger than the community sample. That makes sense, I think. The education for the university sample is pretty one-sided. There, they all have some college by definition, and they tend to be a little bit more democratic. They also tend to have more women in that sample than in the representative sample, and tend to be the student sample tends to be a little bit more white on average. We do test if sample makes a difference, and there'll be one slide about that. So the first treatment that I'll talk about is the contact project. This is based on a video that the Heineken, the beer company, made, where they have 3 sets of 2 people who disagree on something that's political, come together, work together, and eventually they build a bar, and then they can drink the beer if they decide to talk about their differences. So depending on what you feel about Heineken, there's the beer, this may be more or less a convincing reason to talk to somebody, I don't know. But this is just one, I took some screenshots to walk it through. The whole video is just 5 minutes. It's easy to find on YouTube if you're curious about the whole thing. So they have this guy here who talks about his political views as the new right. He also talks about how he doesn't like feminism. The partner that talks with him is this woman here who says that she's from the left and is wearing this shirt that says "Smash the Patriarchy," defines herself as a feminist. They get together and they get instructions to build 2 stools, and they find that they don't have the right instructions, so they have to work together and trade instructions, and they help each other build. I should be clear, they do not know each other's views at this point. They then sit down and after they've built this stuff and describe themselves in adjectives, just a way to like start a conversation. Name things that they have in common with each other, really just ways to start this kind of forming of a relationship. Then they finish building, and it turns out it's a bar. Again, it's a beer commercial at the end of the day. And then then they get this, and then they get beer from a cooler, but they're not yet allowed to open it. Suspense. And then they watch a video of the people from before. So the feminist woman, she hears the guy from the new right say how feminism is bad. The guy from the new right hears the woman talk about how feminism is good and how his views are bad. And so they get that information, and then they're told you can basically sit down and drink the beer together if you want to talk about your differences, or you can go your separate ways. And every group of people in this treatment, the other two groups as well, also all agree, yes, we're going to go drink the beer together. The other groups, their discussions, one was about climate change, both for and against, and the other was about transgender people and their right to exist. And yeah, so it's well done, well shot thing. Oh yes, and then they go, see, they're smiling and drinking beer. And it's so, again, they're trying to bring people together, but it's still a beer company. So why might this work? Why might this depolarize? It shows the people, the audience, the value of speaking, working, and empathizing across differences. It also shows that it's possible and you can do it. Even these people who are diametrically opposed, they're able to do it. We chose to use this particular treatment because in this Strengthening Democracy Challenge I mentioned earlier is the most successful at reducing out-party dislike. And within that Strengthening Democracy Challenge, people could propose different treatments, like there's teams of people who propose things, and so I just want to be clear, this one was created by Daniel Stone and his colleagues. The other treatment that we did is democracy misperceptions. The idea here is that you're basically are told and asked to guess how your political out party will respond to questions, and then you're told what the right answer is. And this is all based on good survey data. Nobody's being lied to or anything like that. So if you're a Republican, you would get this question: do most Democrats support significantly reinterpreting the Constitution in order to block Republican policies? And maybe I would respond definitely. And then if I did that, then you would get this message here, where it's like, oh, actually, sorry, most Democrats actually say never. And so it takes basically advantage of, and then this is repeated with similar questions. So you get this experience multiple times. Basically, this is trying to take advantage of this idea that when people tend to update their beliefs when they find out they're wrong. I know that doesn't always feel true, but good studies suggest that people do update their beliefs when they find out they're wrong. So this takes advantage of that. And essentially it helps participants see that these rival partisans are maybe not nearly as bad as they thought. We chose this one because it's the most successful at reducing anti-democratic attitudes in that Strengthening Democracy Challenge. And before, it's created by other people, Aaliyah Bradley and her colleagues in this case. So we had 3 replication outcomes that we just test. Do we get consistent evidence that these are depolarizing? So we had a measure of out-party dislike. If you're Republican, we use this item here, where we ask you how you rate Democrats, ranging from very cold to very warm. And we reverse score this, so higher scores are more negative views of Democrats. If you're a Democrat, you get one about Republicans. We have a 4-item measure of anti-democratic attitudes that, again, is tied to your partisanship and who your rival party is. But in this, this one is Republicans would get this version here, such as Republicans should reduce the number of polling stations in areas that support Democrats, which is what they're doing. And then support for partisan violence is 4 different items looking at how justified it is to engage in different kinds of violence, such as when, if ever, is it okay for Republicans to send threatening and intimidating messages to Democratic Party leaders. So in the control condition, these are how these outcomes are distributed. A fair amount of out-party dislike, especially Democrats seem to really don't like Republicans. It's not that Republicans love Democrats. There's very little on the left-hand side of that left panel. Anti-democratic attitudes also, I mean, I guess this is a good thing overall, tend to be relatively low, although there is maybe concerning number on the right-hand side of that graph. And support for partisan violence is really quite low overall, but the problem with things like violence is it takes just a few people to cause problems here, but much fewer people are supporting violence. So first we look at whether or not these are depolarizing. So what I'll show you here is, I'm going to show you lots of graphs that are like this. On the x-axis is the treatment effect of the condition compared to the neutral control condition. If things are depolarizing, it should move things to the left. It should be negative. Our study is this purplish color, and then the original Strengthening Democracy Challenge that we're replicating with this part of our analysis is this green dot, so you can also see how our results compare to theirs. And then our different dependent variables, in this case one's focusing on depolarization because they're replicating the past work, is on the y-axis. So first we have out-party dislike, and here the contact project in our study, which is the purple dot, it reduced out-party dislike, same direction as the original, although the original was a bit stronger. And democracy misperceptions also reduced out-party dislike, so it had this depolarizing effect. When we look at anti-democratic attitudes, the democracy misperceptions treatment, again, did reduce these anti-democratic attitudes, and basically the same exact size as in the original. And then for partisan violence, our manipulations here didn't do much, although this is roughly consistent with what the original study found as well. It's just harder to move these around, in part because people aren't scoring very high on it, which I guess is good news in a sense. Okay, so we replicate the original. The treatments depolarize where we would expect them to depolarize. So now we look at side effects. So we looked at 3 potential side effects: reducing political engagement, willingness to confront misinformation and prejudice, and increased animosity towards politically aligned social groups. So for the first side effect, our hypothesis is that depolarization treatments will reduce political engagement. Our reasoning is that basically that rather than engage in these polarizing debates and conflict, people may instead deprioritize and opt out of politics. Right? The person who reads about all this conflict in the news and says, you know what, I'm just staying away from the news, I'm out. There's other work that has linked things like effective polarization to more political engagement. And if that work, if the causal story of that work is right, if you reduce this effective polarization and partisan animosity, then it might also reduce political engagement because conflict in that way can be motivating. Helps you support your group. We measured this with 4 items. These are a little bit different than your traditional political engagement items. We adapted them from another measure of kind of just group support. And we looked at this, and in part we did this because there was not like an election that was coming up that we could use as our dependent variable or something like that. And so we used this one because it got at other ways in which people can support their groups. So if you're a Democrat, you'd get items like this, such as I would donate money to an organization that fights for Democrats' political and legal rights. And this was on a agree to disagree measure. Higher scores are more engagement. So in our control condition, you see it's pretty normally distributed. Republicans may be less engaged, Democrats a little bit more engaged. So do our treatments have effects? So the Contact Project doesn't affect political engagement at all. It's right on 0. It's harder to be 0 if you want it to be. And for democracy misperceptions, this is also a very small effect that's not different from 0. So it seems like when it comes to political engagement, it just might not be a side effect, at least in how we've measured it. I think in the terms of are there unwanted side effects, that's maybe good news, right? That didn't seem to affect engagement. So the second side effect that we looked at was this willingness to confront folks. So basically this is, are you willing to do something that's going to be uncomfortable and maybe uncivil, you're going to cause an argument? And so our hypothesis was that these depolarization treatments are going to reduce people's willingness to confront harmful speech. Basically prioritizing civility and social cohesion, you just maybe want to avoid those fights. Let it go. And so people may be less willing to confront that speech. We have 2 different types of measures here. One, I don't have a good name for, so I call them the Likert version or the Likert version, depending on how you'd like to say that poor man's mispronounced name. And these are, we were inspired by some other work looking at willingness to confront prejudice, but we basically ask for 8 different groups, how likely are you to confront someone who says negative things about the group the next time you see them? And we have some groups that are more Republican aligned and higher power groups within American society, and more Democratic aligned lower power groups. For Republicans and Democrats, those group names specifically, we recode those to be in party or out party, depending on participants' own partisanship. We also had these 4 vignettes that were the ones used by Blair and colleagues in the study I mentioned towards the beginning. There's 4 vignettes, and all of these, you read about a situation where an in-party member hears misinformation or they hear racism from an out-party person, and then the participant is given a binary choice about whether the in-party member should confront the person or not about the speech. I have these vignettes if you'd like to see them more in the question and answer. But for now, I'll just briefly summarize them. So the one about misinformation is, and it depends on whether you're Democrat or Republican, but if you're a Democrat, you'd hear about a Republican claiming that the 2020 election was stolen. And if you're a Republican, you'd hear about a Democrat claiming that the 2016 election was stolen. The other misinformation one is you hear somebody talk about how vaccines cause autism, which, just to be clear for people on YouTube, is a misinformation. I think everybody, you never know who's on YouTube. Gotta make sure. And then there's 2 with racism components. One is, I would say, definitely explicitly racist, where it talks about it's just some person saying disapproving of interracial dating. And then the other racism is kind of like a symbolic measure of symbolic racism, where somebody talks about how Black Americans should just try harder. Still racist, but has this like meritocratic value component to it. So these are, in the control condition, just the distributions of the different confront measures. I've never looked at these distributions before a week ago when we finished collecting data, so like these were new to me. Maybe they're new to you. I don't know. But I think these are interesting. You see like negative things about immigrants from Mexico. Democrats much more likely to say that they're willing to confront those than Republicans are. Here's negative things about transgender people. Negative things about rich people. Actually, Democrats and Republicans are kind of like, that's fine. They're willing to let those things go. Negative things about out party, also people are generally like, that's fine. When we look at the vignettes, remember these are binary. The combined version is the top left here. In general, more people are saying confront than not confront across all of them, but that's especially true for Democrats, the bluish part of the bar. Some of these, the confront racism, that's the explicitly racist one about dating. This one, really way more people are like, yep, confront. But these other ones are, well, there's still more people saying confront than not, but are a bit less lopsided. So first we'll look at the Likert measures, I guess. So same kind of figure as before. The different treatments are the kind of the columns. The different confront dependent variables are on the y-axis, and our effects are on the x-axis. So when it comes to negative things about transgender people, there seems to be no side effect here for either of these conditions. When we look at all of these, most of them do not differ from zero, but there are a few that do. And in particular, for both conditions increase people's willingness to confront negative things that are said about police officers and negative things that are said about the out party. And in this contact project, increases people's willingness to confront negative things said about rich people. These other things are not significantly different from zero. So there aren't broad side effects across all groups, but there are some specific side effects. When we look at the vignettes all combined, there's no significant effect. Because this did not create quite as reliable of a measure, we also looked at them individually. And what happens here is, at least in the democracy misperceptions condition, there is a tendency for people to be less likely to confront blatant racism when they learn that their ideas about democracy are corrected. So looking at as a whole, we see that people are more willing to confront negative things about the out party. Okay, this makes sense, given the goals, but also about relatively high-powered and powerful groups in American society, like police officers and rich people, and at least for one of these, also makes people less willing to confront something blatantly racist. So this decreases the willingness to confront blatant racism, increases willingness to confront negative statements about the police and rich people in the out party. Okay, third side effect, animosity, social group animosity or prejudice or group-based dislike, whatever term you like to use yourself. Our idea here is that depolarization treatments might increase people's expressions of animosity towards politically aligned social groups. Part of the idea here is that we know from past work that animosity towards social groups, both political and non-explicitly political groups, are interconnected with each other. When people have negative views of in the US of like liberals or progressive groups, Democrats and so on, they also tend to have negative views of gay people, transgender people, black people, immigrants, and so on. And so it could be that if you're weakening the animosity towards some of these political groups, it allows for other expressions of prejudice to come through. So we look at this with a really explicit measure here where basically we ask how favorable do you feel about these social groups. These are the social groups that we also included in the confront measure, and we see what happens there. Here's our control condition. This is basically what you might expect if you know American politics and society a little bit, but Democrats tend to not like the police compared to Republicans. Same for rich people and Christians, whereas Republicans tend to are more likely to dislike black people, immigrants from Mexico, and transgender people. So before looking at whether political alignment matters, that's a moderation hypothesis, we just looked at main effects here. And so neither of the conditions affected attitudes towards black people, and actually most of the groups, but it did increase people's or reduce people's dislike of police officers. So people become less polarized towards their political outgroups and more positive about the police. Interesting. There's also this effect on transgender people, but which is I think in part because this contact project video includes a conversation with a transgender person, and then it paints everybody in a very positive light. And so actually, to the extent this reduces transgender prejudice, that makes sense with the video, although maybe not their initial goal. So we tested a variety of pre-registered interactions to see if these other things might condition the results. I'm going to show political party first because that actually is in line with what we ought to test for that third side effect. This figure here is all of the significant interactions of party across all of our dependent variables, across all three side effects. So it's not just the dislike ones. And what's important here first is that there are no animosity measures or dislike measures except for out-party dislike on the y-axis, which means that political alignment of the participant and that political group, the social group in the animosity chart I showed you before, that doesn't matter. So that effect on police, that's true for Democrats and Republicans. The non-effect on black people is true for Democrats and Republicans. But we did find 4 other moderations, which is not actually that many. The vignette confront thing, all of them combined, it's the Contact Project reduces Democrats' willingness to confront, so they're less willing to confront misinformation and racism in the combined score. And part of the reason this happens is actually really specifically to that try harder racism vignette, where Democrats were like way less likely to confront an out-party member about that, and Republicans became a little bit more likely to confront an out-party about their racism. So just interesting. Support for partisan violence, not a very strong interaction effect, but maybe the Contact Project works better for Republicans. And then for democracy misperceptions, again, not a big interaction effect, but maybe this works better for Democrats than Republicans. So when we look at the possible side effects, and I'll get to the other interactions in a minute, we find that this third one about animosity, our prediction was wrong, and instead it seems like it decreases animosity towards the police, but for everyone, not just for Republicans, not just for Democrats, but for our sample. All right, so we have 3 other pre-registered interactions. I'm curious as who thinks whether sample, so that's student, or the representative sample, education or age, which one will have the most significant moderation effects? Anybody have a guess? Education? All right, let's check it out. Well, whether it's going to have the least, we'll find out. But this has one significant interaction effect on this measure of disliking Christians. And it's a pretty weak effect that I don't fully understand in the end. But for our 4 levels of education, seems like some college and high school or less are moving to have a little bit more prejudice towards Christians, whereas bachelor level and postgraduate tend to getting a little bit less prejudice towards Christians. I don't know why, but that's what we find. All right, so what second most interactions? Who's got a guess? Age or sample? Age, all right. Thanks for playing along. Age, lots of, well, from the grand scheme of things, lots of age interactions. Here, these are at kind of just the quintiles of age. And this is the Contact Project at the top here. So lots of moderations by age for the Contact Project. So if we look at the one at the top, it seems like for older adults, the Contact Project increased their likelihood of confronting negative things about immigrants from Mexico, negative things about your in-party, and it's a little bit messier, but maybe also more likely to confront vaccine misinformation. It also seems to reduce dislike towards the police among people who are younger. And then the Christians dislike, again, it seems like maybe the older people are increasing their dislike of Christians from this Contact Project. So it might be how they're interpreting some of these interactions, especially around the transgender one. Maybe they see that as less reasonable, given that it's a little unclear. But age seemed to be important for how people are interpreting that one. Democracy misperceptions, there's one interaction, and it seems like it increased older adults' likelihood of confronting negative things about police officers. All right, so now we have one more of these. Let's see, I think if I just go. So then we have sample. Also didn't seem to matter much, and just on confronting vaccine misinformation, such that the university sample, it really reduced this. So when our students who they completed this study and now our semester ended, so now they've all gone home to their parents, and we'll see if they confront vaccine misinformation from their parents, but potentially not those who are in our Contact Project 1 intervention. So We pre-registered those interactions because we thought they might matter. We didn't have strong hypotheses about them except for a political party. But really it didn't seem like they mattered that much. Age, maybe it seemed like it really impacted how people interpreted that contact project intervention. It might be that there's something about that intervention that you just interpret it differently depending on where you're at in life. I don't know why that would be the case, but maybe it's something about the people interacting and the ages of the people in the video itself. And I don't know. I haven't fully worked this through, but this seems to be something that matters. But things like education doesn't matter, which you might think it should. If my story about where you're at in life influences how you interpret it, something like education might also matter, or whether you're in university currently might matter, and it doesn't seem to. But age might be something to think about. In summary, we replicated these depolarization effects in these two treatments. That's nice. In my corner of the field, we don't always replicate things, so it's nice when it happens. Glad to see this. The side effects were not exactly what we expected. So there's no side effects on engagement. The confronting side effects were pretty limited. It was not towards all groups, but just to a select few. And the animosity side effects were limited and really not exclusive to like politically aligned groups or politically unaligned groups for that matter. At the same time, there were side effects. There's more willingness to confront negative things about powerful groups. So it encourages people to not critique powerful groups, which is interesting. It's less willingness to confront a blatantly racist statement and less dislike of the police. And so when taking those as a whole, it looks like the treatments may reduce polarization, but also have this hierarchy protecting effect, protecting higher status groups from being confronted about negative things that are said about them, as well as letting negative things about a marginalized group slide. I am a kind of person who will talk endlessly about limitations on studies, including those that I run. Also, those that I don't run, we'll talk about limitations all the time. But in this study, we only tested 2 possible interventions. There are many more possible interventions out there. This is purely a budget constraint, and if anybody would like to give us more money, we will run more. YouTube, looking at you guys. The side effects were not identical between the 2 interventions. And so that also should give us pause about saying that those specific side effects are the side effects of all interventions. At the same time, there were side effects. I don't think we should put that aside. We also only tested these interventions in the US. This is in part because that's where I'm located and that's where we got money to study. But it's also a strategic. We're really trying to take the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, where we knew it was a high quality study, we could trust their methods and results, and we wanted to build on something that we knew was solid, and that's why we did that. But it's not obvious that that intervention effects on depolarization are necessarily the same across countries. I've heard, I know of at least 2 different projects that have found that some of these interventions that worked in the US did not work in other contexts, and I suspect that that's probably the norm, just because other contexts have other things that are convincing and useful in that context. So we also don't know that if these side effects will replicate in other political contexts. It's also possible that what is a relevant side effect will be different across contexts. What's relevant in the US might not be relevant in Belgium, and what's relevant in Belgium might not be relevant in the Netherlands, or Norway, or South Africa. Pick your favorite. We only test interventions that we could administer experimentally online. Again, this is purely, in terms of how we chose to run the study. But there's a lot of groups administering interventions in communities, going to different community groups and trying to bring people together in those ways. It's unclear exactly how this transports to that or not. And in general, we just need more work on these community-administered interventions to try to figure out both, do they work well and how well do they work, but also, are there potentially side effects of these as well? When looking across this study, thinking about what I want people to take home from this is that I think we can conclude about these 2 interventions in our US samples that this depolarization interventions can have side effects that reinforce societal hierarchies, so they're not just purely depolarizing. And so if our goal is merely civility, this could still be a quote-unquote success. But if our goal is a just and liberal democracy, this may be seen as counterproductive. And also, if you're running depolarization interventions, I really do think you should be testing and thinking about what possible side effects these could be. I think they could show up in unexpected places, and I think it's something that's useful for scholars who are studying this to think about, and think about it early in the design of these, so that we can have depolarization, but does so in a way that I think advances normative goals of a just and liberal democracy, which I think is something that, as scholars in politics and political science and political psychology, we ought to focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Really, really very interesting lecture.
Thanks.
I'm still thinking. But I want to give the floor to people in the room. Okay, Caroline.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I really want to thank the colleagues who thought about inviting you, because it's really interesting, it's fascinating, and I'm happy you did only one study, that you presented only one study, because it was so rich and so dense, so you really did a great job presenting the findings. So I've got two questions. So the first one is about, what about the independent? Maybe in the US there are no more independents, but how do you treat them in your study? And do you test do you control for strength of partisanship, maybe, or partisan identity? Because that's also something that can, I guess, affect your results. So what about independence and partisanship? First question. And the other one, I would like to push you a bit more on the age effects. So what are, I mean, is it about age? Is it about generation? What is there? What's because you show that actually it was one of the sociodemographic variables that actually showed a lot of interaction effects. So I think this is super interesting, and I would love to push you on that and then see more about that, because here at VUB as well, like, people are also working on like age and generation in politics. So yeah, I would like, if you have time, to hear a bit more about what do you think is there. Is it a life cycle effect, age, or generation?
Sure.
Thank you.
Should I answer now, or are we collecting?
What do you prefer?
I'll answer now.
Okay.
Collecting I never do well with. But so for the independence, I actually partway through realized I forgot to say what I did with independence. But for the forthright sample, which is our more representative sample, we explicitly worked with that survey platform to only recruit people who identified as Democrats and Republicans. This is in part because the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, they also used Forthright for part of their study, and we basically tried to mimic as much as we possibly could between those, to really just be like, look, we are trying to recreate the depolarization context as much as we could. So the independents they're not even in the data set. They are filtered out before they get to our study. In the student sample, just because of how our student sampling thing works and how our IRB likes to work with all this, we basically let everybody in, and then we have measures at the beginning, but then before we analyze, we filtered out the independents. So our student sample in what we analyzed here is 200 and some odd people. But there's actually another couple hundred, but they identify as independents, because a lot of our students, I don't think, see themselves very much in either of the U.S. political parties. But there is something interesting there where, like, there are some people who will say they're independent on partisanship measures, but actually because they're like really, really extreme left wing, and same on the right, actually. And so you have those people also probably could use some depolarization, in at least potentially. And so, yeah, we don't have that all figured out, but that's practically what happened in the study. For the age, it's a good question about whether it's like a generational thing, or maybe, there's something about being older, and then you have between experience and age and both cognitive and personality changes or something like that. My hunch is that it's probably something closer to like a not a generational effect in terms of like these discrete generations, but more like I think the people who are currently, you know, between 60 and 70 in the US, like they just grew up in a different time and they have different experiences throughout that and socialization experiences both as a kid but also as an adult compared to the people who are in our 18 to 28-year-old range. I think that's my hunch. I don't think there's something about being older per se that causes these interactions. Not like, you know, because of cognitive decline, they react this way to the contact. I think it's more about those socialization experiences, kind of like period effects, I guess they would be in that kind of thinking. But I can't pick that apart with this data, but that's my hunch. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark, for the very interesting talk. And I would like to ask you a question about that hierarchy protecting effect itself, and how would you exactly explain that effect? What is the mechanism, and how does that relate to the mechanism that produces the core effects, I would say? Because when I look to it from the outset, the hierarchy protecting effect is exactly the opposite as what happens regarding the core-dependent variables. So I'm wondering, do we see here a kind of compensation effect? For example, like what people have found in the context of stereotypes, the stereotype content model that you see, if people stereotype groups based on competence, they would compensate that with another effect on the warmth I mentioned. So that in the end, if you would kind of summarize both the core effects and the side effects, that there is a zero effect.
Yeah.
Do you know what I...
Yeah, so I should say, like, whatever I will say next is all just post hoc theorizing kind of thing, because we didn't get what we didn't have the results we expected to have. My post hoc theorizing here is that, or what I think might be happening, is that actually I don't think it's a compensating thing, but rather I think in part because people have so little faith in the system, the U.S. political system, because of in part because of polarization. By reducing some of this polarization, I think it also then gives people some faith and hope in the system, and so then are feeling more like they would like to protect that system, whether that's rich people or the police, also the police are also representative of the state in that case. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about it, is that these treatments are also kind of potentially providing some sense that, oh, actually things are going okay here, and so then we should defend the system as part of that. But yeah, we unfortunately don't have measures that we're going to get at that. At one point, we were going to include like a different set of animosity measures, and then we were like, no, we should include these because then if we get confront effects, we can see if that's just due to dislike or something. And that was our mechanism worry, and it turns out that was the wrong mechanism worry to have. But that's the benefit of hindsight, and that's why we run studies, because we don't know what we'll find. But, yeah, thanks.
Thanks for this very interesting presentation, Mark. In terms of potential hypotheses that can give some explanations, and also to test these potential explanations on why does it happen. What if the depolarization is bringing about depoliticization, but not in terms of political disengagement, but turning matters of structural inequality and deeply problematic aspects of democracy and how society is structured into a matter of opinion. Because then if you see the other one is being presented systematically as, well, but it does have a different opinion than yours, but you still can have a beer with this person. So if it's depoliticizing you, so it's steering you down in your willingness to be more militant in your beliefs, right?
Yeah.
And it's also related to the question you frame of whether does then liberal democracies might or might not need that. It's a political question as well.
Yeah.
Whether
right.
we need militant democracies, and the answer to that aligns with different political traditions, right? And the behavioralist tradition would say, don't care, right?
Yeah.
While feminist or Marxist or others would say, yeah, we need militant democracies.
Right.
Otherwise, this is what might happen if we don't problematize inequalities, structural, socioeconomic divides, etc. So what about this depolitization effect, which is different from disengagement, right? It's more at the value level and the willingness to defend militantly the position.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think that makes some sense to me, in the sense, like, in the Heineken commercial / contact project intervention, there's like some, when they decide to come together, it depends a little bit actually on the pairs of people, but like there's these two guys that talk about differences they have about climate change, and one of them, they were just kind of talking about like, oh yeah, the best way to convince somebody is like sit down and have a beer, and it was just like something to kind of discuss, and it was a little bit like, to me, it's a little bit jarring to watch, because the guy who's worried about climate change at the beginning is like existentially troubled about this, and then he builds a stool with another guy, and then he's like, well, maybe we could find a way to meet in the middle. And I was like, was it not, I find it hard to like, was it not existential troubling for you in the first place? I don't know. So but I could see how it takes this very politicized thing and says, actually, that's not in the political domain anymore. It disconnects it. I think that's plausible. Have to think about the best ways to test that. And that would, I think, would help with some of the confront kind of things. I'm not sure, I'd have to think about more if it explains all the results, but I think that is one way to think about it, is it takes this domain that used to be part of political conflict and takes it away. And I think for some conflicts that could be okay, but like for others, you are missing out on where power is located and who has the power to change those those hierarchies and things like that, and that's normatively a problem. Yeah.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Francois Hendricks. I teach political communication here in Brussels. That's my angle. But I'd like to go back to the backdrop of this whole discussion, which is polarization. I find that it's one of those notions which everyone understands, but which is extremely vague when you want to sort of take it apart and analyze it the way you do. So if we all agree we've reached a point of polarization which is problematic, so we need to find ways to lower that level and get back to something healthy, we need to do better than just talk about polarization, right?
Sure.
So civility is one of those angles where we say, well, one of the problems is that we're not able to have a civil conversation anymore. And I think that's probably the one that is most directly connected to how this can damage the functioning of a democracy, is that we've gone through a threshold whereby what used to be arguments and debates about ideas and about even ideology has now come to a point where there's just confrontation and where your opponent has become your enemy. I mean, all these things we've identified. Right. So I was just wondering whether the studies, the type of studies that you just completed and the ones that you've cited, is there a way we can apply those methods to very specific aspects of polarization, which we would identify as key to restore a healthy democratic debate, for example, to start with, right? See what I mean?
Yeah.
It reminds me of the discussion. I've also been active in media literacy. So everyone says we should do more about media literacy, but again, it depends what you mean by that. For whom? What aspect of that would you? Because if you just claim that you want to do better in media literacy, then you're not going to get anywhere, right? So it reminds me of that. So I just, from all the unpacking and slicing and analyzing you've done, what would you identify as the key variable on which we can actually work operationally, like a doctor working on blood pressure, not just on, I'm not feeling well, doctor, type of things, and how you can put that in your next study to find some way to actually have agency on this evolution.
Yeah, I think some of it is, it's a good point that the polarization as like as a noun is broad. And people use it to mean all sorts of things, myself included. It's a great shorthand that means everything and nothing, as all good shorthands do. I think actually it really depends on what one's particular goals are, and I think I'm the kind of person who's like let 1,000 flowers bloom sort of thing, and so I'm not super I personally don't like being too restrictive on what goals people might like to have in this space. But I do think, like, for personally, I'm a little bit less concerned about this out-party animosity, out-party dislike, in part because you see it all over the place. Like, most countries have this to some degree, and some of those countries are really robust democracies, and some of them aren't. And it's not obvious to me that that's, like, the key driving bad thing in the world. Again, I'd like to be liked, and please be nice to me. But the anti-democratic attitudes, I find this a little bit more like a thing that might be useful to try to turn the dial on, and especially if you can get to a place where people will punish candidates for not being supporting democratic values enough. And so, like, a challenge I think we have in the U.S. currently is that people in general will have more kind of pro-democracy attitudes, but they don't punish politicians for being anti-democratic in their actions because they're so much don't like the other party. And so that is how to overcome that challenge is, I think in the US is harder. In more multi-party systems where you can go to another party that's maybe more pro-democratic but similar ideological, I'm jealous of getting to vote in those systems. But that is, like, I think maybe more plausible in those kinds of systems. But that's the dial I would personally turn. Also violence, because I think violence really messes things up, and also just the kind of this culture that's happening in many places where we have this culture of people receiving threats and getting threats and things like that. I think those also really turns people off from getting engaged in politics who might be good people to have engaged in politics and being representatives and members of parliament and so on. But yeah, if your life is then turned upside down and miserable because your family's getting threats, that's like also not a good thing. So those are the two that I think are personally, I'm like, those are where I'd try to turn the dials, but are I think also the harder dials to turn.
Thank you, Mark, for giving us a lot of food for thought. I have two small questions about the TVs mainly.
Yep.
Wondering, you looked at out-party dislike. What would happen if you take a typical affective polarization measure where you subtract it from in-group dislike? Would you find the same results? Or do people just dislike everybody in this sample? And then a second question relates to the groups that you mentioned, high status, low status. I think with the demographics, and of course you had a list of pre-registered moderators, but with the demographics that you measured, maybe you could do some additional exploratory interaction analysis where you look at the role of high or low status, if people are white or non-white, if people are, you have education, but probably maybe income is also in there.
I don't think we have income. It's hard to ask students about income.
True.
In a way that's sensible, I should say. It's easy to ask them. It's harder to get sensible answers. But
because a lot of this, and it reflects a bit Bram's point as well. Reminds me of the sedative or ironic intergroup contact effects that you kind of replicate here with another intervention. So I wonder, is this maybe it's only prominent for people with a low status or people with a high status, and why that would be?
Yeah, those are both good thoughts. So in terms of the difference score version of effective polarization, I mean, we have the data, we can do it, just haven't. My hunch is that it's going to be pretty similar. unless it is also reducing people's liking of their in-party at the same time. Again, this is my hunch. I don't think that's probably what's happening, but it could be, and we have the data to test that, and so that's easy to add to our list of models here. The other, yeah, in terms of these other moderators, so we have kind of get a sense of what we have actually, because we include a lot of them as pre-treatment controls. I just got to get right. Yeah. So we have gender, age, race, ethnicity, education, their party, and their party strength, and then the sample they're from. So one thing that we might do, we still have to talk about the kind of steps for finalizing where we're at on this study. But one possibility is looking at, there's these nice machine learning models now that you can, is it the random causal forest, but they will look for nonlinear treatment effects across a range of potential moderators and do it in a way that is, well, on the one hand, highly exploratory, but less prone to these kind of random effects. And so, because I think it's also possible that maybe it's like an age and gender combination. Maybe there's something like that. Or maybe, yeah, it's party strength, as one of the first question askers kind of alluded to. And just kind of putting these all together and seeing if there are these like maybe subgroups with particularly strong or different effects. Not something we've done yet, but I think there's potentially other room for this, yeah.
Thanks. Maybe if I can add one more
course.
naughty question.
Sure.
Do you see this as a confirmation of system justification theory? Why and why not?
Yeah, I mean, it might be. I don't know. Like, I mean, it's part of the challenge with answering that is that I think it's a little unclear precisely what system justification theory might predict in this situation. But I think if the idea is that like there are cases where people will justify or see the social system or hierarchies or whatever as more just and fair, I mean, I think, sure, but I think most social scientists agree that does happen in certain cases. Whether the precise psychological mechanisms the theory proposed contribute to this, I don't know, and that's just not what the study is designed to test. The other relevant theory here is like a social dominance theory kind of thing. That's the one that comes to mind as well, and also where I pulled the hierarchy kind of enhancing or promoting language from. But yeah, the precise psychological mechanisms here also, as Rama alluded to, we don't have much evidence for that one way or the other. Yeah.
Any more questions? No? Then I think we can have a coffee together outside. Thank you again, Mark.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the questions.